Sometimes a man reaches a point where $20 feels like too much to spend on hope. Jonas Pike had reached that point when he bought the old cave house by Whispering Lake. At 62, with only his dog Rufus for company, Jonas thought he was buying a place to die quietly. The cave house had been carved into limestone cliffs decades ago and sat empty ever since. Perfect for a broken man who wanted to disappear. Jonas moved in with his few belongings and settled into the stone rooms. But the cave held secrets. Hidden in the walls, he found belongings from 40 years ago. A woman's things. Letters never sent. A journal full of dreams. And carved into the stone, a name he never forgot. The name belonged to his first love, the woman who vanished in a snowstorm the year he left for war. What really happened to her all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of Jonas Pike's dog tags pressed against his chest as he stood on the narrow ledge outside his new home, watching the morning mist rise from Whispering Lake. The metal was warm from his body heat, worn smooth by 40 years of restless handling during sleepless nights. Vietnam had ended decades ago, but some wars never stop fighting their battles in a man's heart. Rufus, a grizzled German shepherd mix with clouded eyes and grey around his muzzle, pressed close to Jonas's leg. The dog understood trauma in ways most humans never would. They'd found each other at the county shelter 3 years ago. Two broken souls recognizing kindred spirits. Rufus had been returned twice by families who couldn't handle his night terrors, the way he'd wake whimpering from dreams of whatever hell he'd escaped before finding his way to the shelter. Jonas knew those dreams. He'd been living them since 1968. The cave house stretched back into the limestone cliff like a wound in the earth. Previous owners had carved rooms deeper into the rock over generations, creating a maze of chambers that felt both ancient and timeless. The main living area opened onto the ledge where Jonas stood, with a ceiling high enough for a tall man to walk upright. Rough-hewn beams supported the entrance, their wood darkened by decades of mountain weather. Beyond the first chamber, smaller. Rooms branched off like fingers of a stone hand. A bedroom carved into solid rock, a kitchen area with shelving chiseled from the cave walls, and storage spaces that disappeared into shadows. Water seepage had stained the walls in abstract patterns that reminded Jonas of maps to places that didn't exist. The floor was mostly natural stone, worn smooth by countless footsteps, with patches of rough planking where earlier inhabitants had tried to level uneven surfaces. A primitive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney carved straight up through the rock to emerge somewhere high above on the cliff face. The whole place smelled of stone and time, with undertones of wood smoke from fires lit by previous tenants. Whispering Lake stretched before him like a mirror reflecting the surrounding peaks. Morning light painted the water silver and gold, while pine forests climbed the mountainsides until they gave way to bare granite and snow-capped summits. The lake was small enough to see across, but large enough to lose yourself in its moods. Sometimes glass still, sometimes choppy with mountain winds, always changing yet somehow eternal. Jonas had paid $20 for this place to Henry Blackwood, whose family had owned the property for 3 generations without ever living in it. Henry was eager to be rid of it, calling it a white elephant that cost more in property taxes than it would ever be worth. Jonas didn't care about worth. He cared about distance, from people, from memories, from the weight of a world that expected him to be whole when pieces of his soul had been left in Southeast Asian jungles. The real estate transaction had taken place in Murphy's hardware store, the closest thing to a business district that Pine Ridge offered. Henry had scrawled out a deed on the back of a feed store receipt, and Jonas had counted out $20 bills with hands that shook more than they used to. The whole town of Pine Ridge consisted of maybe 200 souls scattered across the valley, most of them 3rd or 4th generation families who'd seen boom and bust cycles come and go like seasons. Sarah Mitchell had grown up in Pine Ridge. Her family had run the general store until her father's drinking drove them out of business. Jonas could still see her behind the counter, 17 years old with auburn hair that caught the light, like autumn leaves, sorting penny candy into glass jars with the careful attention she gave everything. Her smile had been the last good thing he remembered before the world went dark. They'd been planning to marry when he got back from Vietnam. Young love, the kind that believes in forever, despite evidence that forever is a luxury most people can't afford. Jonas had carried her picture through mud and blood and sleepless nights in places whose names he'd tried to forget. But when he came home, changed, haunted, jumping at sudden sounds, Sarah was gone, vanished in a February blizzard while he was still learning to walk without shaking, still trying to understand why he'd survived when better men hadn't. The official story was that Sarah had gotten lost in the storm while walking between her house and the general store. Search parties had combed the woods for weeks after the snow melted, but Pine Ridge was surrounded by thousands of acres of wilderness where a person could disappear without a trace. Jonas had joined those searches when he finally made it home, walking grid patterns through underbrush and calling her name until his voice gave out. They never found so much as a piece of her clothing. Jonas's daily routine at the cave house was deliberately simple. Wake before dawn, make coffee on the camp stove he'd set up in the kitchen area, let Rufus out to patrol the shoreline while the lake caught the first light. Breakfast was usually oatmeal or eggs, eaten while sitting on the ledge watching the water. The silence was profound. No traffic, no machinery, just the lap of waves against the rocky shore and the occasional call of a loon. He'd brought few possessions: a duffel bag of clothes, basic cooking equipment, a battery-powered radio that pulled in a country station from 2 valleys over, and a wooden box containing his military decorations, discharge papers, and 3 photographs. One showed his unit in Vietnam, young faces trying to look brave. Another was his parents, dead now for 15 years. The third was Sarah, taken the summer before he left, her hand shading her eyes as she smiled at something beyond the camera's frame. Mornings were for maintenance. The cave house needed work, replacing rotted floorboards, clearing debris from the drain system that channeled water away from the entrance, repairing the primitive plumbing that consisted mostly of gravity-fed pipes running from a spring higher up the cliff. Jonas had learned basic carpentry and mechanics in the army, skills that served him well in a place where the nearest hardware store was a 40-minute drive down a winding mountain road. Afternoons belonged to Rufus. The old dog loved to explore, sniffing along game trails that crisscrossed the mountainside or wading into the shallows to watch fish dart between submerged rocks. Jonas would follow, grateful for the company and the excuse to move his body. At 62, he was still strong, but arthritis was beginning to stiffen his hands, and old shrapnel wounds ached when the weather changed. The physical activity helped keep both his body and mind occupied. Evenings were the hardest time. When the sun disappeared behind the western peaks and shadows filled the cave, Jonas felt the familiar weight of solitude pressing down like a physical force. He'd light the fireplace and try to read. Westerns. Mostly stories about men who solved their problems with direct action rather than endless worry. But often he'd find himself staring into the flames, remembering things he'd tried to forget. Rufus seemed to understand these dark moods. The dog would position himself close enough to touch, offering silent companionship without demands or judgment. Sometimes Jonas would talk to him, explaining plans for the next day's projects or wondering aloud about the cave's previous inhabitants. Rufus would listen with the patient attention of someone who'd heard similar conversations before. The town of Pine Ridge had changed little since Jonas's youth. Murphy's Hardware still occupied the same building, though old Murphy had passed and his son ran it now. The general store where Sarah had worked was boarded up, its windows covered with plywood that someone had painted over with advertisements for long-defunct businesses. A few new houses had appeared on the outskirts of town, mostly vacation cabins for city people who came up on weekends to hunt or fish. Martha Henley ran the library now, a small building that had once been a one-room schoolhouse. She'd been Sarah's friend, 2 grades behind in school, but close enough in age that they'd shared secrets and dreams. Martha was one of the few people who remembered Jonas fondly, who didn't look at him with the mixture of pity and suspicion that some veterans attracted. She'd invited him for coffee the day after he bought the cave house, sitting across from him in the library's reading room while autumn rain drummed against tall windows. "Sarah talked about you constantly that last year," Martha had said, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "She never stopped believing you'd come home safe. Even when the news got bad, even when other boys from the valley didn't make it back, she kept saying you were too stubborn to die in some foreign country." Jonas had gripped his coffee cup to keep his hands steady. "I should have written more, should have called. Communication wasn't easy from where you were. We all understood that." Martha's eyes had been kind but direct. "What happened to her wasn't your fault, Jonas. I hope you know that. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your bones were different things entirely. Guilt was a patient enemy. It would wait years for the right moment to strike, finding you in quiet hours when your defenses were down." Jonas had carried Sarah's death like shrapnel, a piece of metal too close to vital organs to remove safely. Now standing outside his cave house with Rufus at his side, Jonas tried to imagine what Sarah would think of his retreat from the world. She'd always been the optimistic one, finding possibilities where he saw only problems. During their brief courtship, she'd talked about traveling, about seeing places beyond Pine Ridge's valley walls. She'd wanted to be a teacher, to help children discover that the world was larger and more wonderful than they imagined. Instead, she died alone in a snowstorm, while he was learning to kill strangers in a jungle halfway around the world. The mathematics of loss never balanced. Good people died, while others, like himself, survived for reasons that made no sense. Jonas had stopped asking why decades ago. Now he was content to ask for nothing more than silence, and the company of a dog who understood that some wounds never fully healed. The cave house felt like the right place for such acceptance. Carved from living rock, it was solid in ways that modern construction never achieved. The walls had witnessed decades of human stories, families seeking shelter, hermits seeking solitude, lovers seeking privacy. Jonas could feel the weight of those stories in the stones, an accumulation of human experience that made his own troubles seem smaller and more manageable. As the morning mist began to burn off the lake, Jonas decided to explore the deeper chambers more thoroughly. He'd been living primarily in the front rooms, using the bedroom and kitchen areas, while leaving the back passages largely untouched. But something about the quality of light filtering through cracks in the rock suggested there were surprises waiting in the shadows, secrets that previous tenants had left behind like messages in bottles. Rufus followed him back into the cave, the dog's nails clicking against stone as they moved beyond the familiar rooms into territory they'd barely explored. Jonas carried a battery-powered lantern, its beam cutting through darkness that seemed to have weight and texture. The air grew cooler as they moved deeper, carrying scents of mineral water and something else, something organic that might have been old wood or fabric. The passage narrowed, then opened into a chamber larger than Jonas had expected. His lantern beam revealed carved shelves along the walls, primitive but carefully made, sized for storing personal belongings. A few items remained: a pottery bowl with a hairline crack running down one side, a wooden comb missing several teeth, a piece of fabric that might once have been part of a dress or apron. But it was the carved letters in the far wall that stopped Jonas cold, his lantern beam trembling as he read the name etched into stone with painstaking care. Sarah Mitchell, 1968. Below the name, in smaller letters, someone had carved, "Waiting for Jonas to come home." Jonas's hands shook as he traced the carved letters with his fingertips, feeling the rough edges where someone had chipped away stone with patient determination. The letters were deep enough to last centuries, cut with the kind of care that spoke of love and desperate hope. Below Sarah's name and message, the date stared back at him, February 1968, the same month she'd disappeared. The same month he'd been crawling through tunnels near Ku Chai, half a world away. Rufus whined softly, sensing his master's distress. The dog pressed against Jonas's leg, offering warmth and comfort, while Jonas tried to process what he was seeing. Sarah had been here, in this cave, carving her name and waiting for him to return from a war that had already stolen too much. She hadn't gotten lost in a blizzard, walking between buildings in town. She'd been here, in the place that was now his refuge, living in these stone chambers while he fired his rifle at shadows in Southeast Asian darkness. The lantern beam wavered as Jonas's grip loosened. He had to set it down to keep from dropping it, the yellow light casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. The revelation hit him like physical blow. All these years, all the guilt about not being there when she needed him. And she'd been waiting in the very place he'd eventually come to escape his memories of losing her. Jonas sank to his knees on the stone floor. 40 years of grief and regret washing over him like a dam breaking. He'd spent decades believing she died because he wasn't there to protect her, that somehow his absence had led to her wandering into a storm. But this changed everything. Sarah had found shelter, had made it to safety, had carved his name in stone while believing he would come home to find her. The practical part of his mind began asking questions, even as his emotions reeled. How long had she been here? What had happened to her? Why hadn't anyone found evidence of her presence during the searches? But those questions felt secondary to the overwhelming realization that his understanding of her death and his role in it had been completely wrong. Rufus nudged his hand, encouraging Jonas to keep breathing, to stay present instead of disappearing into the spiral of guilt and memory that had claimed so many of his nights. Jonas focused on the dog's warm fur, the reality of stone beneath his knees, the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in the cave chamber. Slowly, he picked up the lantern and began examining the chamber more carefully. Now that he knew what to look for, evidence of human habitation became obvious. The carved shelves held more than he'd first noticed. A tin cup, a spoon worn smooth by use, a small mirror with silver backing that had gone black around the edges. These weren't artifacts left by some anonymous previous tenant. These were Sarah's belongings, preserved in stone chambers like a tomb. Behind a natural ledge in the rock, Jonas found a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. His hands shook as he unwrapped it, revealing a collection of items that made his chest tight with recognition. A faded photograph of himself in uniform, taken just before he'd shipped out. The silver locket he'd given her for her 18th birthday. And underneath everything, a letter addressed to him in Sarah's careful handwriting. The envelope was yellowed with age, but intact, protected by the oilcloth and the cave's stable temperature. Jonas held it for a long moment before opening it, afraid of what he might find, but unable to resist. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, and Sarah's voice seemed to speak to him across 4 decades. My dearest Jonas, if you're reading this, then you made it home safe and found me like I always knew you would. I've been living in our special place since the snow started, waiting for spring and for you to come back to me. I know you said never to come here alone, but Daddy's drinking got worse after you left, and home wasn't safe anymore. The cave is warm enough with the fire, and I have supplies to last until the weather breaks. Jonas had to stop reading, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't shed in years. A special place. He remembered now they'd discovered the cave during a hiking expedition the summer before he left, exploring along the lakeshore and finding the narrow path that led up to the entrance. They'd spent an afternoon inside, planning adventures and talking about the future. Sarah had joked about living there someday, away from her father's anger and the town's gossip. Jonas had laughed and said maybe they'd buy it when they got married, fix it up as a weekend retreat. He forced himself to continue reading. I dream about our wedding every night. I've planned everything. The dress I'll wear, the flowers we'll have, the house we'll build together. Martha says I'm foolish to wait, that the war might take you away from me, but I know better. You're too stubborn to die in some foreign place. You promised to come home, and Jonas Pike never breaks his promises. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Sarah's daily life in the cave, her hopes for their future, her unwavering faith in his survival. She wrote about reading by firelight, about watching the lake freeze over, about the way snow piled up outside the entrance until she felt like she was living inside the mountain itself. There was no fear in her words, no sense of desperation. She wrote with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and was willing to wait for it. But it was the final paragraph that broke Jonas's heart completely. The baby is moving more now. I can feel him kicking when I lie still at night. I hope he has your eyes and your stubborn streak. I hope he grows up in a world where wars are just stories in history books. I'm going to tell him every day how brave his daddy was, how you fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. If something happens to me before you get home, know that I loved you with everything I had, and this little one will too. Jonas dropped the letter as if it had burned him, the paper fluttering to the cave floor. Her baby, Sarah, had been pregnant with his child. In all the years since her disappearance, no one had mentioned a pregnancy. Either she'd hidden it successfully, or the people who knew had taken the secret to their graves. The mathematics of grief shifted again, multiplying his loss beyond what he'd thought possible. Not only had he lost Sarah, but he'd lost a child he'd never known existed. A son or daughter who would have been 40 years old now, who might have had children of their own. An entire lineage erased by whatever had happened in this cave during the winter of 1968. Rufus pressed closer, sensing the deepening of his master's distress. The dog's presence anchored Jonas to the present moment, preventing him from spiraling completely into despair. Jonas picked up the letter again, forcing himself to read the date at the top. February 15th, 1968, 2 weeks before the blizzard that the town remembered as the worst storm in decades. Something had happened after she wrote this letter. Something that had prevented her from leaving the cave when spring came, from being found by the search parties that had combed the area after the snow melted. Jonas looked around the chamber with new eyes, searching for clues about Sarah's fate and that of their unborn child. In the deepest corner of the chamber, partially hidden by fallen rocks, Jonas found the answers he'd been dreading. A small grave, carefully marked with stones arranged in the shape of a cross. Next to it, a larger depression in the cave floor, covered with flat rocks that had been placed with obvious care. Even after 40 years, the intent was unmistakable. Sarah and their child were buried here, in the cave that had been their secret place, the cave that had now become Jonas's final refuge. She'd carved his name in stone and waited for him to come home, carrying their baby and believing in a future that would never arrive. Instead of dying lost and alone in a blizzard, she died here in their special place, still waiting for a man who was fighting a war that had already claimed more than he'd realized. Jonas knelt beside the makeshift graves, his hands pressed flat against the stone markers. 40 years too late, he'd finally come home to find her. Jonas spent the next 3 days unable to leave the cave, moving between the front chambers and Sarah's resting place like a man caught between 2 worlds. He'd arranged her belongings on the carved shelf where he'd found them, creating a small shrine that felt both sacred and heartbreaking. The faded photograph of himself in uniform watched over the space. A young soldier's face full of confidence he'd never feel again. Rufus stayed close, understanding in the way that animals do when grief threatens to swallow their humans whole. The dog brought Jonas his meals when he forgot to eat, nudged him toward his sleeping bag when exhaustion finally overcame the restless energy of shock. On the 3rd night, Jonas finally slept deeply enough to dream, and Sarah came to him as she'd been at 17, laughing, her auburn hair catching sunlight, her hand warm in his. In the dream, she wasn't angry about his long absence or his failure to find her in time. She simply smiled and said, "You came home eventually. That's what matters." When he woke, Jonas felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a sense of peace that didn't come from numbness or resignation. but from a deeper understanding that some stories have endings different from what we imagine. On the fourth morning, Jonas walked into Pine Ridge for the first time since buying the cave house. The trip down the mountain road took 40 minutes in his old pickup truck, winding through pine forests that had grown thicker since his youth. He drove slowly, in no hurry to arrive, using the time to rehearse conversations he wasn't sure he was ready to have. Martha Henley was shelving books when Jonas entered the library, her movements efficient and practiced. She looked up as the door chimed, her face brightening with genuine pleasure at seeing him. At 58, Martha had aged gracefully, her grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes still sharp with intelligence and kindness. "Jonas, what a nice surprise. I was hoping you'd come by again soon." She set down her stack of books and gestured toward the reading area where they'd talked before. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." Jonas accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm mug while Martha settled across from him. The library was quiet, except for the tick of an old clock and the rustle of pages as someone worked at a computer terminal in the corner. "I found something in the cave," Jonas said without preamble. "Something that changes everything I thought I knew about Sarah's death." Martha's expression grew serious, her attention focused completely on his words. Jonas told her about the carved chamber, about Sarah's belongings and the letter, about the revelation of the pregnancy and the small graves hidden in the deepest part of the cave. Martha listened without interruption, occasionally touching her hand to her throat, in a gesture of surprise or sorrow. "A baby," she whispered when Jonas finished. "I never knew. Sarah never said anything, and she would have told me something like that." "The letter was dated 2 weeks before the blizzard," Jonas said. "Maybe she was planning to tell people when I got home, when she could be sure everything would work out." Martha was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "That explains some things I never understood," she said finally. "Sarah's father came by the library about a month after she disappeared, asking if I knew anything about her that might help with the search. He seemed desperate, almost frantic. I thought it was just grief, but maybe he suspected something." "What kind of something?" "Sarah had bruises sometimes during that last year before you left. She always had explanations, fell down the stairs, walked into a door, but some of us wondered. Her father's drinking was getting worse, and Sarah was bearing the brunt of his anger." Martha's voice was gentle but direct. "Moving to the cave might have been about more than waiting for you to come home. It might have been about finding somewhere safe." The idea hit Jonas like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't just been waiting for him in their special place. She'd been hiding there, protecting herself and their unborn child from a father whose drinking had turned violent. The romantic notion of her patiently waiting for her soldier to return was replaced by something more complex and heartbreaking. A young woman making desperate choices to survive until help arrived. Why didn't anyone check the cave during the searches? Jonas asked, who would have thought to look there? The official story was that she got lost walking between her house and the store during the blizzard. The search parties focused on the most likely routes, the places where someone might seek shelter if they were caught in the open. Martha paused, choosing her words carefully. And to be honest, some people assumed she'd run away. Girls did that sometimes in those days, disappeared to the city when small-town life became unbearable. Jonas felt another piece of his guilt shifting, reshaping itself around new information. For 40 years, he'd carried the weight of not being there when Sarah needed him, but the truth was more complicated. She'd found safety, had made it through months of winter in the cave, had survived long enough to write letters full of hope and love. Whatever had finally taken her and their child, it hadn't been his absence that killed her. "I need to know what happened to her," Jonas said. Not just that she died, but how and when. She was strong enough to survive in that cave for months, smart enough to prepare for the long term. "Something specific went wrong," Martha nodded thoughtfully. "There might be records somewhere. Doctor visits, maybe, if she was pregnant. Or pharmacy records if she needed medicine. Dr. Morrison was the only doctor in town back then, and he kept meticulous files." His son took over the practice, might still have the old records. Would you? Jonas started, then stopped. He'd been about to ask Martha to make inquiries for him, but realized this was something he needed to do himself. Sarah deserved that much from him. Even 40 years late. Would I help you look into it? Of course. Martha's voice was warm with understanding. Sarah was my friend too, Jonas. I've wondered about her fate for decades. If there are answers to be found, we should find them together. Jonas felt a loosening in his chest, a easing of the solitary burden he'd carried for so long. Martha had known Sarah, had loved her as a friend, had her own questions that deserved answers. This investigation wouldn't just be about his guilt or his grief, it would be about honoring a young woman's memory and understanding, the choices she'd made in her final months. There's something else, Jonas said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. I found this with her other belongings. Another letter, but this one was never finished. He handed Martha the second letter, watching her face as she read Sarah's unfinished words. The handwriting was weaker than in the first letter, the lines less steady, as if Sarah had been ill or injured when she wrote it. My dearest Jonas, Martha read aloud. The baby came early during the worst of the storm. I tried to get to town for help, but the snow was too deep and I was too weak. I managed to get back to the cave, but something is wrong. The bleeding won't stop and I'm so cold despite the fire. If you find this someday, know that I loved you until my last breath. Our son looks like you. He has your stubborn chin and your gentle hands. I named him Michael after your father. I hope that's all right. Martha's voice broke on the final words, and Jonas felt tears he thought he'd exhausted over the past 3 days. Their son, Michael Pike, who'd lived long enough to be born, long enough to be held and named and loved, but not long enough to see spring or meet his father. The weight of loss was staggering, but underneath it, Jonas felt something unexpected, gratitude. Sarah hadn't died alone. She'd held their child, had given him a name, had filled his brief life with love, even as her own was ending. In her final hours, she'd still believed Jonas would come home eventually, would find her letters and understand how much she'd loved them both. That evening, Jonas returned to the cave with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Martha had given him the name of Sarah's nephew, David Mitchell, who still lived in Pine Ridge and worked as a forest ranger. She'd also provided contact information for Dr. Morrison's son, who might have access to medical records from 1968. But first, Jonas needed to return to the chamber where Sarah had spent her final months and look for something he'd glimpsed but not fully. Processed in his shock over finding the graves, Rufus followed him into the deeper chambers, the dog's presence a comfort as Jonas made his way back to what he'd begun thinking of as Sarah's room. This time, he brought multiple lanterns and took his time examining every detail. What he'd initially seen as a simple shelter revealed itself as something more complex, a carefully organized, living space created by someone who'd planned to survive the winter near the spot where he'd found the letters. Jonas discovered a small wooden object partially hidden beneath a loose stone. He lifted it carefully, recognizing immediately what it was, a heart carved from pine wood, about the size of his palm, with their initials intertwined in the center. He'd made it for Sarah during the summer before he left for Vietnam, spending hours with his father's woodworking tools to get the curves exactly right. The carved heart brought back a flood of memories from that last golden summer. They'd been so young, so certain that love could overcome anything the world threw at them. Jonas had presented the heart to Sarah during a picnic by the lake, watching her face light up as she traced the carved letters with her fingertip. She'd kissed him then with the kind of passion that made him believe he could survive anything as long as he had her love to come home. To finding the heart in the cave meant Sarah had carried it with her when she fled her father's house, had treasured it enough to bring it to safety, along with her other precious belongings. Jonas held it now, feeling the smooth wood that had been worn softer by decades of handling. She'd held this same object while waiting for him to return, perhaps drawing comfort from the physical reminder of his love. Behind the heart, Jonas found something that made him sit back in wonder, a small pile of wood shavings and the beginning of another carving. Sarah had been teaching herself to work with wood, perhaps planning to surprise him with a gift when he returned. The half-finished piece appeared to be a small cradle, crude but made with obvious care and determination. She'd been preparing for their child's arrival, creating what she could with limited tools and materials. Jonas spent the next hour cataloguing everything in the chamber, creating a mental inventory of Sarah's final months. She'd gathered supplies systematically, canned goods, blankets, candles, medical supplies that suggested she'd known she was pregnant and had tried to prepare for childbirth alone. A small pile of baby clothes, hand-sewn from fabric that might have come from her own dresses, showed touching preparation for a child she'd never see grow up. But it was the journal that provided the most insight into Sarah's state of mind during those long winter months. Jonas found it tucked behind the carved shelves, bound in leather and filled with Sarah's neat handwriting. The entries began in November 1967 and continued through February 1968, chronicling her decision to leave her father's house, her discovery that she was pregnant, and her growing certainty that the cave would provide safe shelter until Jonas returned from the war. November 15th, 1967. Daddy hit me again today, harder than before. I can't hide the bruises anymore, and people are starting to notice. Mrs. Henderson at the post office asked if I was all right, and I didn't know what to say. Martha suspects something too. She keeps offering to let me stay at her house, but I can't bring that trouble to her family. November 28th, 1967. I think I'm going to have a baby. I've missed 2 months now, and I get sick every morning. I should be scared, but mostly I'm happy. Jonas and I will have a family when he comes home. I just need to figure out how to stay safe until then. December 10th, 1967. I've been thinking about the cave Jonas and I found last summer. It's far enough from town that Daddy would never think to look there, but close enough that I could get supplies when I need them. The spring nearby means fresh water, and with enough firewood and food, I could make it through the winter. It feels right somehow, waiting for Jonas in the place where we planned our future. Jonas read through months of entries, watching Sarah's handwriting grow rounder as her pregnancy progressed, her words revealing a young woman who faced her situation with remarkable courage and practical intelligence. She wrote about gathering supplies without arousing suspicion, about learning to start fires and cook over an open flame, about the way the baby moved inside her and her dreams for their life together. The final entries, written in February just before the blizzard, showed Sarah's growing weakness, but also her determination to survive for their child's sake. She wrote about pain that wouldn't go away, about bleeding that scared her, about her growing fear that something was wrong with the pregnancy. But even in her fear, she maintained hope that Jonas would return in time to help her, that their love story would have the happy ending she'd planned. February 20th, 1968. The pains are getting stronger, and I think the baby is coming early. I'm scared, but I keep thinking about Jonas and how brave he is. If he can face whatever he's facing over there, I can face this. Our baby will be born in the place where Jonas first told me he loved me. There's something beautiful about that, even if it's not how we planned it. Jonas closed the journal, overwhelmed by Sarah's courage and the depth of love that had sustained her through months of isolation and fear. She'd been barely 18 years old, pregnant and alone, hiding from an abusive father while waiting for a boyfriend who was fighting a war thousands of miles away. Yet her words revealed no self-pity, no anger at the circumstances that had led her to such desperate measures. She wrote with the voice of a woman who believed absolutely in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. Rising from the stone floor, Jonas looked around the chamber with new understanding. This wasn't just the place where Sarah had died. It was the place where she'd lived with hope and determination, where she'd prepared for their future and protected their unborn child with fierce maternal love. The cave had been her sanctuary, not her tomb. and she'd filled it with dreams of the life they would build together when the war ended and he came home. Jonas picked up the wooden heart and held it against his chest, feeling its warmth and the smooth places where Sarah's fingers had worn the wood soft. For the first time since finding her grave, he felt something other than grief and regret. He felt pride in the woman he'd loved, admiration for her strength, and a growing determination to honor her memory by understanding the full truth of what had happened during those final days of winter 1968. The next morning brought David Mitchell to Jonas's door, a lean man in his 40s wearing the olive-green uniform of the Forest Service. Martha had called ahead, explaining the situation in terms that respected both Jonas's privacy and the gravity of what had been discovered. David stood on the narrow ledge outside the cave entrance, his expression serious but not unkind, clearly struggling with how to begin a conversation about family secrets that had been buried for 40 years. "Mr. Pike," David said, removing his ranger hat and holding it respectfully in both hands. "I'm David Mitchell, Sarah's nephew. Martha told me you found some things that belong to my aunt." Jonas invited him inside, grateful for Rufus's calming presence as they settled in the main chamber. David's resemblance to Sarah was subtle but unmistakable. The same intelligent eyes, the same way of tilting his head when listening carefully. He accepted coffee and listened without interruption as Jonas recounted the discoveries of the past week, occasionally asking quiet questions that showed he was processing information that challenged everything his family had believed about Sarah's disappearance. "I was only 7 when she vanished," David said when Jonas finished. "But I remember her clearly. She was the only adult who treated me like I had something important to say. My mother was Sarah's older sister, and they were close despite the age difference. Mom always said Sarah was too trusting, too willing to see the good in people, even when they'd shown her their worst." David paused, looking around the cave with new understanding, especially their father. "My grandfather was a hard man, Mr. Pike, the kind who believed problems could be solved with his fists and that women should be grateful for any attention they received, even the violent kind. Sarah bore the worst of it because she was the youngest and had nowhere else to go. Did your mother know Sarah was pregnant? If she did, she never said anything to me. But that would explain some things." David set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "After Sarah disappeared, my mother went through a bad period. Guilt, I think, for not doing more to help her sister. She used to say Sarah had been planning something, making preparations. But Mom thought it was just talk about moving to the city when you came back from the war." Jonas felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Sarah's preparations hadn't been secret from everyone. Her sister had noticed but misinterpreted the signs. "What kind of preparations?" "Saving money, gathering supplies, asking about things like medical care for women in rural areas. Mom thought Sarah was planning for your return, maybe looking into moving somewhere you could start fresh together." David's expression grew thoughtful. "But if she was pregnant and planning to hide in the cave until you got back, those preparations take on a different meaning entirely." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, worn soft with age. "Mom passed 5 years ago, but before she died, she gave me this. Said it belonged to Sarah and that I should keep it in case anyone ever came asking questions about what really happened to her." Inside the envelope, Jonas found a collection of documents that painted a clearer picture of Sarah's final months. There were receipts for supplies purchased in neighboring towns, canned goods, medical supplies, warm clothing, always paid for with cash and spread across multiple stores to avoid attracting attention. A handwritten list in Sarah's careful script itemized everything needed for a long-term stay in primitive conditions, including preparations for childbirth. Most revealing was a letter Sarah had written to her sister but never sent, dated just 2 weeks before she disappeared from town. In it, Sarah explained her plan to disappear until Jonas returned, her fear of their father's escalating violence and her determination to protect the baby she was carrying. She begged her sister not to worry, promised to send word when it was safe, and asked for prayers that Jonas would come home soon. She never sent this, Jonas said. Looking up from the letter, Mum found it in Sarah's room after the disappearance. Dad, my grandfather, was ransacking the house, looking for clues about where she might have gone. He was frantic, almost crazy with worry, which surprised everyone because he'd never shown much concern for Sarah's welfare when she was around. David's voice carried an edge of old anger. Mom took the letter and some other things, hid them away. She was afraid of what Dad might do if he found evidence that Sarah had been planning to leave. Jonas studied the receipts again, noting the dates and locations. Sarah had been methodical in her preparations, purchasing supplies over several weeks from stores in 3 different towns, never buying enough in one place to raise suspicions. The medical supplies were particularly telling, items specifically chosen for someone expecting to give birth without professional help. "There's something else," David said, pulling a small wooden box from his jacket. Mom said this was Sarah's most precious possession, something she'd hidden in her room and never let anyone else see. Inside the box, Jonas found a collection of his letters from Vietnam, each one carefully preserved and arranged in chronological order. Sarah had saved every word he'd written to her, even the short, censored notes that revealed little about his experiences, but spoke of his love and his determination to come home. Beneath the letters were photographs, pictures of Jonas in uniform, snapshots from their summer together, even a picture of the cave entrance taken during their exploring expedition. But it was the item at the bottom of the box that took Jonas's breath away. A wedding dress pattern, carefully cut from tissue paper and pinned to white fabric that had been purchased but never sewn. Sarah had been planning their wedding while hiding in the cave, creating the dress she would wear when he finally came home to marry her. "She never stopped believing you'd make it back," David said quietly. "Even when the news from Vietnam was bad, even when other boys from the valley came home in coffins, Sarah kept planning for your future together." Mom said it was heartbreaking to watch. This young woman putting together a hope chest for a life that might never happen. Jonas ran his fingers over the delicate fabric, imagining Sarah working by firelight in the cave, stitching seams and dreaming of their wedding day. The dress pattern was for a simple design, elegant but practical, the kind of gown a young woman would choose for a small ceremony, followed by a lifetime of shared adventures. "I need to show you something," Jonas said, leading David deeper into the cave toward Sarah's chamber. It was time to share the full truth of what he'd discovered, to let Sarah's family know that their questions about her fate finally had answers, even if those answers brought as much pain as comfort. Standing before the small graves in the deepest part of the cave, David removed his hat again and stood in respectful silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion but steady with acceptance. "She found peace here, didn't she? Away from the violence, in a place filled with love and hope." He looked around the chamber, taking in the careful arrangements Sarah had made, the evidence of months spent preparing for a future she would never see. "This is where she wanted to be when you came home. She chose this place," Jonas nodded, understanding for the first time that Sarah's death in the cave wasn't a tragedy of abandonment, but a story of love and courage that deserved to be remembered with honor rather than grief. She'd died in the place where they'd first dreamed of their future together, surrounded by preparations for the life she'd planned to build with him and their child. 3 days later, Jonas sat in Dr. Morrison's small medical office, waiting while the younger Dr. Morrison searched through filing cabinets that dated back to his father's practice. The current doctor, William Morrison, was a thoughtful man in his 50s who'd heard the story from Martha and understood the importance of finding any medical records that might shed light on Sarah's condition. "During her final months, here we are," Dr. Morrison said, pulling a thick folder from a cabinet marked 1967-1968. "Sarah Mitchell. My father did see her, though not as often as he should have. Given what I'm reading here." Jonas leaned forward as the doctor opened the file. revealing handwritten notes in the elder Dr. Morrison's precise script. The records painted a troubling picture of a young woman seeking medical care while trying to hide the evidence of ongoing abuse. November 1967, Dr. Morrison read aloud. Patient presents with bruising on arms and torso, claims to have fallen downstairs. Recommends more careful attention to household safety. Notes patient seems anxious, reluctant to discuss home situation. The doctor looked up from the file with a grim expression. My father suspected domestic violence, but didn't pursue it aggressively. Different times, unfortunately. The records continued through December, documenting visits where Sarah sought treatment for various injuries while carefully avoiding any mention of pregnancy. But Jonas could read between the lines, requests for vitamins and nutritional advice, questions about women's health that suggested Sarah was trying to care for herself and an unborn child without revealing her condition. January 15th, 1968, Dr. Morrison continued. Patient reports fatigue, nausea, missed menstrual periods. Pregnancy test positive. Patient requests confidentiality regarding results. Appears distressed when asked about father of child and living situation. Prescribed prenatal vitamins, advised to schedule regular checkups. Jonas felt his chest tighten. Sarah had been trying to get proper medical care, but her fear of her father discovering the pregnancy had limited what she could reveal to the doctor. The final entry in the file was dated February 10, 1968, just 2 weeks before she'd written her last letter in the cave. Patient missed last 2 appointments. When contacted by telephone, father reports Sarah is visiting relatives out of town and will reschedule when she returns. Note unusual tone in father's voice. Recommends following up if patient doesn't return within reasonable time frame. Dr. Morrison closed the file and looked at Jonas with professional sympathy. My father tried to follow up, but Sarah's father was evasive about when she'd return. Given the patient confidentiality laws and social attitudes of the time, there wasn't much more he could do. If he'd known she was living alone in primitive conditions while pregnant, he would have intervened immediately. The revelation that Sarah's father had actively concealed her disappearance from medical professionals added another layer to Jonas's understanding of her desperation. She hadn't just been hiding from violence. She'd been cut off from the medical care she needed during a high-risk pregnancy. Is there anything in the records about complications she might have faced? Jonas asked. Dr. Morrison reviewed the notes again, his expression growing more concerned. The blood work from her last visit showed some irregularities that my father flagged for follow-up. Low iron levels suggesting anemia, elevated white cell count that could indicate infection or other complications. For a pregnant woman living without medical supervision, these could have been serious warning signs. Jonas left the medical office with photocopies of Sarah's records and a heavy heart. The clinical details confirmed what he'd suspected from reading her journal. Sarah had been fighting not just isolation and primitive living conditions, but potential medical complications that would have been dangerous even with proper care. That afternoon, he drove to the cemetery where Sarah's parents were buried, needing to confront the man whose violence had driven his daughter to such desperate measures. Sarah's father's headstone was simple granite, bearing only dates and a perfunctory inscription. Jonas stood before it, feeling none of the rage he'd expected, only a deep sadness for the fear that had shaped the final months of Sarah's life. Rufus wandered among the headstones while Jonas tried to understand how a father could create such an atmosphere of terror that his pregnant daughter would choose to live alone in a cave rather than seek help at home. The medical record suggested that Sarah's father had known more about her disappearance than he'd admitted to authorities, had actively prevented her from maintaining contact with people who might have helped her. On the drive back to the cave, Jonas stopped at the site where the old Mitchell house had stood. The building had been torn down years ago, but the foundation stones remained, overgrown with weeds and scattered by decades of weather. Jonas walked among the ruins, trying to imagine Sarah growing up here, trying to understand the daily fear that had finally driven her to flee. Back at the cave that evening, Jonas found himself drawn again to Sarah's chamber, but this time with a different purpose. Instead of searching for more clues about her death, he began the work of properly honoring her life. He carefully cleaned and organized her belongings, creating a more formal memorial that reflected the love and hope she'd carried, even in her darkest hours. The wooden heart took its place at the center of the arrangement, surrounded by her journal, the unfinished baby cradle, and the wedding dress pattern. Jonas added his own contribution, a photograph of himself in uniform that he'd kept all these years, positioned so it would be the first thing someone would see when entering the chamber. As he worked, Jonas found himself talking to Sarah, explaining what he'd learned about her final months, sharing his admiration for her courage and his sorrow that he hadn't been there when she needed him most. But the guilt that had driven him to the cave was transforming into something different, a determination to ensure that her story was remembered with the honor it deserved. "I understand now," he said aloud, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You weren't waiting for me to rescue you. You were surviving on your own until I could come home to the family you were building for us. You were stronger than either of us knew." Rufus settled beside him as Jonas arranged the final elements of the memorial. The dog's presence a reminder that love and loyalty could endure even the longest separations. Outside the cave, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant conversation, and Jonas felt for the first time since his return to Pine Ridge that he was exactly where he belonged. The cave had been Sarah's sanctuary, the place where she'd chosen to wait for their future to begin. Now it would be her monument, a testament to the kind of love that refuses to surrender even in the face of impossible circumstances. Jonas was finally ready to be the guardian of that legacy, the keeper of a story that deserved to be told with pride rather than buried in shame and regret. Jonas was arranging firewood near the cave entrance when Rufus began behaving strangely, sniffing at a section of the back wall that they'd explored dozens of times. The dog whined and pawed at loose rocks, his behavior insistent in the way that suggested he'd detected something important. Following Rufus's lead, Jonas examined the area more carefully and discovered that what he'd taken for a natural rockfall was actually a deliberately constructed barrier. Behind the fallen stones, Jonas found a passage he'd missed entirely, a narrow tunnel that angled deeper into the mountain, carefully concealed by someone who'd wanted to hide whatever lay beyond. The opening was just wide enough for a person to crawl through, and the placement of the concealing stones showed the kind of systematic effort that spoke of desperation rather than casual secrecy. Jonas gathered his lanterns and squeezed through the passage, emerging into a chamber that took his breath away. This wasn't another room carved by previous inhabitants of the cave. This was a natural cathedral in the mountain, with soaring stone walls that disappeared into darkness above, and a floor worn smooth by underground water that had carved the space over millennia. But it was what the chamber contained that stopped Jonas cold. This wasn't Sarah's hiding place. Someone else had been living here, someone who'd shared the cave system during those final months of winter 1968. Scattered around the chamber were men's belongings, a military-issue sleeping bag, combat boots, and clothing that bore the unmistakable signs of hard use in difficult conditions. At the center of the chamber, Jonas found a makeshift camp that told a story he'd never imagined. A wounded soldier had been hiding here, someone who'd obviously been through hell and had sought shelter in the most remote place he could find. Empty medical supply containers suggested serious injuries, while personal effects revealed an identity that changed everything Jonas thought he knew about Sarah's final months. The dog tags belonged to Corporal Michael Santos, United States Army, with a birth date that would have made him 22 years old in 1968. Jonas recognized the name. Santos had been reported missing in action during the Tet Offensive. His body never recovered, his fate officially listed as unknown. But here was evidence that he'd made it home, wounded and traumatized, only to hide in the mountains rather than return to civilization. A journal written in Santos's shaky handwriting revealed the truth about Sarah's final weeks. She hadn't died alone from childbirth complications. She'd been caring for a wounded soldier while fighting her own battle for survival, sharing her meager supplies and medical knowledge with someone who needed help even more desperately than she did. January 28th, 1968. The girl found me half dead in the snow near the lake. Brought me to her cave, shared her food and fire. She's pregnant, barely more than a kid herself, but she's got the kind of strength you don't see much. Says her name is Sarah, and she's waiting for her soldier to come home from Vietnam. I didn't have the heart to tell her what it's really like over there. February 5th, 1968. Sarah's getting weaker, but she won't admit it. She insists on taking care of me when she can barely take care of herself. I've seen plenty of courage in combat, but this girl has something different. She believes in hope even when everything around her is falling apart. She talks about her Jonas like he's going to walk through that cave entrance any day and make everything right. February 15th, 1968. The baby came during the worst storm I've ever seen. Sarah was brave, but it went wrong from the start. Too much bleeding, too much pain. I did what I could with the medical supplies, but I'm no medic, and she needed a real doctor. The baby lived for 3 hours, a beautiful little boy who looked just like the pictures of his father that Sarah keeps with her things. Jonas had to stop reading, overwhelmed by the revelation that his son had lived, however briefly, and had been held and comforted by his mother and a stranger who'd become their guardian in those final desperate hours. Michael Pike Santos. Sarah had named their son after Jonas's father and the soldier who'd tried to save them both. February 16th, 1968. Sarah died this morning, just as the storm was breaking. She made me promise to bury them together, to make sure they weren't alone. She kept saying Jonas would come home someday and would want to know they'd been together at the end. I've done terrible things in the war, but helping this girl face death with dignity might be the only good thing I'll ever do. The journal continued for several more days, documenting Santos's efforts to create proper graves for Sarah and the baby, his decision to remain in the cave until his own wounds healed, and his gradual realization that he couldn't return to a world that wouldn't understand what he'd experienced. The final entries revealed his plan to disappear entirely, to let the army continue listing him as missing rather than try to explain where he'd been and what he'd witnessed. March 10th, 1968. I'm strong enough to travel now, but I don't know where to go. The army thinks I'm dead, my family thinks I'm missing, and I feel like a ghost caught between worlds. Sarah believed in second chances, said love could overcome anything if you had enough faith. Maybe she was right, but I'm not ready to test that theory. I'll head deeper into the mountains, find somewhere to start over where nobody knows my name or what I've done. At the bottom of the journal, Santos had left a final message specifically addressed to Jonas. If you're reading this, then you made it home like Sarah always said you would. She loved you more than life itself, talked about you every day until the end. She and your son didn't die alone. They had each other, and they had someone who made sure they were treated with the respect they deserved. Sarah made me promise to tell you that her love for you was the strongest thing she ever felt, stronger than fear or pain or death itself. She said to tell you that loving you was the best decision she ever made. And she'd make it again, even knowing how the story would end. Jonas sat in the hidden chamber, surrounded by evidence of a story that was both more tragic and more beautiful than anything he'd imagined. Sarah had died caring for a wounded stranger, sharing her last resources with someone who needed help, maintaining her compassionate nature even as her own life ebbed away. And Santos, a young soldier broken by war, had honored her memory by ensuring she and their son received a proper burial and that their story would eventually be found by the man they'd both been waiting for. The second set of belongings Jonas had discovered earlier suddenly made sense. Santos had moved between the two chambers, using the larger space for daily living while keeping the smaller chamber as a memorial to Sarah and the baby. He'd spent weeks in the cave system, healing physically while wrestling with his own demons, ultimately choosing exile over an attempt to rejoin a society he no longer felt connected to. But there was more. Hidden beneath Santos's journal, Jonas found something that changed his understanding once again. A letter addressed to Jonas Pike. Pine Ridge, Montana, dated March 1968. Santos had written it but never sent it, perhaps uncertain whether Jonas had survived the war or whether delivering such devastating news would cause more harm than comfort. The letter contained details about Sarah's final days that her own journal hadn't captured, her moments of joy when talking about their planned wedding, her fierce determination to survive for their baby's sake, her absolute certainty that Jonas would come home and understand the choices she'd made. Santos had witnessed a kind of love that transcended circumstances, and his letter was both a testament to Sarah's character and an attempt to ensure that Jonas would understand the true scope of what he'd lost and the depth of what he'd been loved with. Standing in the cathedral chamber with Rufus at his side, Jonas felt the final pieces of his 40-year puzzle clicking into place. Sarah hadn't died alone, abandoned, or afraid. She died surrounded by love. Her love for Jonas, her love for their son, and the unexpected compassion of a stranger who'd honored her memory by making sure her story would eventually reach the man she'd never stopped believing in. Jonas spent the next week in a state of profound reflection, processing the complete transformation of everything he'd believed about Sarah's death. The discovery of Michael Santos's presence during those final weeks had shifted the narrative from tragedy to something approaching grace. A story of two broken people finding each other in the darkest of circumstances and offering comfort when comfort seemed impossible. But the revelation also raised urgent questions that demanded answers. If Santos had survived and eventually left the cave system, where had he gone? Was he still alive somewhere, carrying the memory of those weeks with Sarah? Did he know that Jonas had finally come home and found their story? The thought that the man who'd comforted Sarah and witnessed their son's brief life might still be alive filled Jonas with a desperate need to find him. Martha proved invaluable in beginning the search. Her decades of library work had given her skills in research and record-keeping that Jonas lacked, and her connections throughout the region provided access to information that might otherwise have remained buried. They started with military records, trying to trace what had happened to Corporal Michael Santos after his official designation as missing in action. "The army has him listed as presumed dead," Martha explained, spreading photocopied documents across the library's reading table. His family held a memorial service in 1969, but no body was ever recovered. There's no record of him ever making contact with military authorities or family members after February 1968. The trail seemed cold until David Mitchell suggested they approach the search differently. As a forest ranger, he had access to databases that tracked permits, licenses, and land use records throughout Montana and neighboring states. If Santos had chosen to live off the grid in wilderness areas, there might be traces of his presence in official records that civilian researchers couldn't access. "There's a pattern here," David said 3 days later, calling Jonas to the ranger station where he'd been working through decades of files. Starting in 1970, there are reports from various wilderness areas about a man who'd appeared during emergencies, lost hikers, injured campers, hunters caught in bad weather. Always the same description: military bearing, extensive medical knowledge, refuses to give his name or accept rewards. Local rangers started calling him the Ghost because he'd help people and then disappear before authorities could question him. The reports came from across the northern Rocky Mountains, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, northern Colorado. The pattern suggested someone who moved seasonally between wilderness areas, someone with survival skills and medical training who'd chosen to live entirely outside normal society while still maintaining enough humanity to help others in need. The last confirmed sighting was in Glacier National Park in 1995, David continued. A family trapped by a rockslide said a man in his 50s appeared, treated their injured daughter's broken leg with professional competence, then guided them to safety. When park rangers arrived, he was gone. The description matches all the previous sightings. About 6 feet tall, graying hair, military bearing, gentle manner with civilians, but clearly uncomfortable around authority figures. The timeline fit perfectly. Santos would have been in his 50s by 1995, and his reluctance to deal with official personnel matched the behavior of someone who'd been living under an assumed identity for decades. But 1995 was nearly 30 years ago. If Santos had still been alive then, he'd be in his 80s now. Assuming he'd survived the harsh realities of wilderness living, Jonas found himself consumed by the need to find Santos, driven by questions that went beyond mere curiosity. This man had held Jonas's dying son, had comforted Sarah in her final hours, had ensured they received proper burial when no one else even knew they were missing. Santos had witnessed the most important and tragic moments of Jonas's life, had been present for events that Jonas would never experience, but desperately needed to understand. The search took on new urgency when Martha discovered a more recent connection. A retired park ranger named Bill Carson, who'd worked in Glacier during the 1990s, still lived in the area and had been involved in several of the incidents attributed to the ghost. Martha contacted him, and he agreed to meet with Jonas to share what he remembered. Carson was in his 70s, a weathered man with intelligent eyes who'd spent 40 years in wilderness areas and had developed an intuitive understanding of the kind of person who chose to live outside normal society. He met Jonas at a coffee shop in Kalispell, and bringing with him a folder of unofficial notes he'd kept about the mysterious helper who'd appeared and disappeared in his jurisdiction for over 2 decades. He saved a lot of lives, Carson said without preamble. Always appeared when people needed help most, always had exactly the skills required for whatever emergency he was facing. I tried for years to track him down, not to arrest him or cause trouble, but to thank him. The man was a one-person search and rescue operation. Carson's notes painted a picture of someone who'd mastered wilderness survival, but retained deep compassion for others in distress. Santos, if it was indeed him, had apparently developed an extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, weather patterns and backcountry navigation that allowed him to move through wilderness areas like a ghost while monitoring the activities of legitimate visitors who might need assistance. The last time I saw him was in 1998, Carson continued. I was leading a search for a missing hunter when I found the man we'd been looking for already warming himself by a fire, his broken ankle splinted and his hypothermia treated. When I asked who'd helped him, he pointed to a ridge about a mile away where I could just make out a figure watching us through binoculars. By the time we got there, whoever it was had vanished. Carson reached into his folder and pulled out a photograph that made Jonas's breath catch. It was grainy and taken from a distance, but it clearly showed a man in outdoor clothing, standing on a rocky outcrop, his posture unmistakably military despite his civilian clothes. The figure was too far away to make out facial features, but something about his bearing suggested someone comfortable in wilderness solitude. I always thought he was probably a veteran, Carson said. The way he moved, the way he assessed situations, the quality of his field medicine, that's military training. My guess was Vietnam. Someone who came home changed and never quite figured out how to fit back into normal life. The photograph had been taken near a remote area of Glacier National Park, known for its isolation and difficult access. Carson provided detailed directions to the location, warning that it would require serious hiking and camping skills to reach. The area was accessible only on foot, with no roads or maintained trails for the final 10 miles of approach. Jonas left the meeting with a sense of mission that had been missing from his life for decades. Finding Santos wouldn't bring Sarah and their son back, wouldn't change the fundamental tragedy of their loss, but it would provide closure to a story that had shaped the last 40 years of his life. More importantly, it would allow him to thank the man who'd ensured that Sarah and baby Michael hadn't died alone and forgotten. The practical challenges of mounting a search expedition were significant. Jonas was 62 years old, in decent shape, but not prepared for the kind of backcountry hiking that would be required to reach Santos's last known location. The area Carson had described was genuine wilderness. No cell phone coverage, unpredictable weather, and terrain that could be dangerous even for experienced hikers. But David Mitchell solved that problem by volunteering to lead the expedition. As a forest ranger, he had both the skills and the authority to conduct a search in federal wilderness areas. More importantly, he understood the personal significance of the mission and wanted to help complete Sarah's story in whatever way possible. "We'll treat it as a humanitarian welfare check," David explained as they planned the expedition. "There's enough documentation of this person's activities over the years to justify an official inquiry into his current status. If he's still alive and living in that area, he's probably in his 80s now and might need assistance." Martha insisted on being included in the planning, though she wouldn't be able to make the actual hike. Her research skills had been crucial in developing leads, and she wanted to help prepare for what might be their only chance to find Santos. Together, they gathered supplies, studied topographical maps, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios they might encounter. The night before the expedition was scheduled to begin, Jonas sat in Sarah's chamber in the cave, surrounded by the memorial he'd created and the evidence of her final months. He spoke aloud to her about the journey he was undertaking, explaining his need to find the man who'd been with her at the end, who'd witnessed their son's brief life and ensured they'd been treated with dignity. Rufus would stay with Martha during the expedition. The old dog wasn't up to the physical demands of wilderness hiking, and Jonas needed to focus completely on the challenging terrain ahead. As he prepared his pack and checked his equipment one final time, Jonas felt a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life since returning from Vietnam. Tomorrow, he would begin the final chapter of Sarah's story, and perhaps find a measure of peace that had eluded him for 4 decades. The trail into the remote section of Glacier National Park proved even more challenging than Jonas had anticipated. 3 days of hiking through increasingly difficult terrain had tested his endurance and reminded him that 62-year-old bodies responded differently to stress than the young soldier's frame that had carried him through Vietnam. David Mitchell set a measured pace, stopping frequently to check Jonas's condition and ensure they weren't pushing beyond safe limits. On the morning of the 4th day, they found the first sign that someone had been living in the area recently. A shelter built against a massive boulder showed the kind of thoughtful construction that spoke of long-term habitation rather than temporary camping. The structure was nearly invisible from more than 20 feet away, built with such careful attention to natural camouflage that it seemed to grow from the landscape itself. "Military engineering," David observed, examining the shelter's construction. "Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. This could withstand serious weather and stay hidden from anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it." Jonas ran his hands along the shelter's walls, noting the careful selection of materials and the precise craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. This wasn't the work of a casual survivalist. It was the home of someone who'd chosen to live completely outside civilization while maintaining the highest standards of fieldcraft. Inside the shelter, they found evidence of recent occupation. A sleeping area was arranged with military precision, while storage spaces contained carefully organized supplies that suggested someone who'd spent decades perfecting wilderness living. Most significantly, they found medical supplies of a quality and variety that confirmed their quarry had continued helping injured people, even in his self-imposed exile. But it was the small shrine in the corner of the shelter that confirmed they'd found the right person. Arranged on a natural rock shelf were photographs that took Jonas's breath away, pictures of Sarah that could only have been taken during her final weeks in the cave. She was visibly pregnant in the images, smiling despite the primitive conditions, holding items that Jonas recognized from her belongings. At the center of the shrine sat a locket that Jonas recognized immediately. The silver pendant he'd given Sarah for her 18th birthday. The one he'd found among her belongings in the cave. Beside it lay a small wooden cross, hand-carved with obvious care, bearing the inscription Michael Pike Santos, 1968, in letters that matched the carved message Sarah had left in the cave wall. "He's been carrying her memory all these years," Jonas whispered, touching the photograph with trembling fingers. "Just like I have." David examined the shelter more systematically, looking for clues about how recently it had been occupied. The evidence suggested their timing was fortunate. Whoever lived here had been present within the last few days, possibly even hours. Cooking implements still held traces of recent use, and bedding showed the impression of someone who'd slept there recently. "We should set up camp nearby and wait," David suggested. "If he's still in the area, he'll come back eventually." These supplies represent too much investment to abandon permanently. They established their own camp, a respectful distance from the shelter, close enough to monitor it, but far enough away to avoid seeming threatening to someone who'd spent decades avoiding human contact. Jonas found himself nervous in a way he hadn't experienced since combat, the anticipation of finally meeting the man who'd shared. Sarah's final weeks felt almost overwhelming. As afternoon moved toward evening, Jonas sat watching the shelter while David prepared their simple dinner over a small camping stove. The wilderness around them was profoundly quiet, broken only by the sound of wind through pine trees and the distant call of birds. This was the kind of solitude that could either heal a wounded soul or drive it deeper into isolation, depending on what demons someone brought with them. "There," David said quietly, pointing toward a ridge about half a mile away. Jonas followed his gaze and saw a figure silhouetted against the setting sun, standing motionless on a rocky outcrop. Even at that distance, there was something unmistakably watchful about the person's posture, the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate threats from long range before deciding whether to approach or disappear. The figure remained still for several minutes, clearly studying their camp and trying to determine their intentions. Jonas felt an overwhelming urge to call out, to somehow communicate across the distance that he came not as a threat, but as someone seeking understanding and closure. But instinct told him that patience would be more effective than urgency with someone who'd survived 40 years of wilderness solitude. Slowly, the figure began moving down from the ridge, following what appeared to be a game trail that would eventually lead to the general area of their camp. The approach was cautious but deliberate, suggesting someone who'd made a decision to make contact rather than simply observe from a distance. Jonas felt his heart rate increase as the reality of the encounter approached. After 40 years of questions and 40 years of guilt, he was about to meet the man who'd held his dying son and comforted the woman he'd loved more than life itself. The weight of that moment, the culmination of a search that had begun with $20, and a cave house threatened to overwhelm him completely. The man who emerged from the tree line was both exactly what Jonas had expected and completely surprising. Michael Santos was in his late 70s, but moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades navigating difficult terrain. His hair was white, his face weathered by exposure to mountain elements, but his eyes were alert and intelligent. He wore clothes that showed the kind of careful maintenance possible only with military discipline, patched but clean, worn but serviceable. He approached their camp slowly, his hands visible and empty, stopping about 20 feet away in the universal posture of someone seeking to communicate peaceful intentions. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed but tempered by decades of solitude. "You're looking for me," Santos said. "It wasn't a question. I saw you at my shelter. Takes considerable effort to reach this place. Must be something important." Jonas stood slowly, aware that this moment represented the culmination of everything that had driven him to the cave house, everything that had sustained him through the discoveries of the past months. Face to face with the man who'd shared Sarah's final weeks, he found himself struggling for words that could encompass the magnitude of what he needed to say. "I'm Jonas Pike," he said finally. "Sarah Mitchell was—" "I know who you are," Santos interrupted gently. "You look just like the pictures she carried. She talked about you every day, showed me those photographs so many times I could have picked you out of a crowd anywhere." His expression softened with memory. "She never stopped believing you'd come home safe." The confirmation that Santos recognized him, that Sarah had spoken of him during those final weeks, broke something loose in Jonas's chest. 40 years of wondering what she'd thought in her last days, whether she'd been angry at his absence or disappointed in his failure to return in time, dissolved in the face of Santos's gentle certainty. "I found the cave," Jonas said. "Found her journal, your journal, the graves. I need to know—" His voice broke and he had to pause before continuing. "I need to know she wasn't afraid, that she and the baby weren't alone." Santos stepped closer, his weathered face showing deep compassion. "She wasn't afraid, not at the end. Worried about you, worried about whether you'd understand the choices she'd made, but not afraid." He gestured toward a fallen log that could serve as a makeshift bench. "Sit. There's a lot you should know about those final weeks." David remained respectfully silent as Jonas and Santos sat facing each other. Two old soldiers finally meeting across the decades that had shaped both their lives. Santos spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation in his mind countless times, knowing that someday he might have the chance to deliver it. "She found me half dead in a snowbank near the lake," Santos began. "I'd been walking for days, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, not really caring if I lived or died. Sarah was collecting firewood when she saw me fall. She could have left me there. She was pregnant, alone, already struggling to survive. Instead, she dragged me to safety and spent the next 3 weeks nursing me back to health." Santos described Sarah's daily routine during those weeks. Her careful rationing of supplies to accommodate 2 people instead of 1. Her gentle insistence on treating his wounds, despite her own increasing weakness. She'd shared everything. Food, warmth, medical supplies, without complaint or hesitation. "She told me about your summer together, about the plans you'd made for when you came home. She showed me the wedding dress pattern, talked about the house you'd build, the children you'd raise. Even when she was in pain, even when the pregnancy was getting difficult, she never stopped planning for your future together." The description of their son's birth was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Santos had assisted as best he could with his limited medical knowledge, but complications beyond their ability to treat had made the outcome inevitable. Baby Michael had lived for 3 hours, long enough to be held and named and loved, long enough for Sarah to sing him the lullabies she'd planned to share with Jonas. "She made me promise to tell you that loving you was the best thing she ever did," Santos said, his voice thick with emotion. "She said even if she'd known how the story would end, she'd make the same choices because those months of loving you and carrying your child were worth whatever price she had to pay." Jonas wept then, openly and without shame, mourning not just the loss but celebrating the love that had sustained Sarah through her darkest hours. Santos waited patiently, understanding that some griefs needed to be fully felt before healing could begin. When Jonas finally composed himself, Santos reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope that bore Jonas's name in Sarah's careful handwriting. "She wrote this the day before she died," Santos said. "Made me promise to find you someday and deliver it personally. Took me 40 years, but I keep my promises to people who matter." With trembling hands, Jonas accepted Sarah's final gift, words written specifically for him during her last hours, carried faithfully by a stranger who'd become the guardian of their love story. 6 months later, Jonas stood on the familiar ledge outside the cave house, watching morning mist rise from Whispering Lake, as he had countless times before. But everything had changed since that day in the wilderness, when Michael Santos had placed Sarah's final letter in his hands. The words she'd written during her last hours on Earth had become the foundation for a peace Jonas had never thought possible. "My beloved Jonas," the letter had read, If you're reading this, then Michael kept his promise and found you. I'm so tired now, but I'm not sad. Our son lived long enough for me to tell him about his brave father, long enough for me to sing him the songs I planned to teach him when you came home. He was beautiful, Jonas. He had your gentle hands and your stubborn chin. And I know he would have grown up to be just like you. Sarah's final words had been about forgiveness, not asking for it, but offering it. She'd known Jonas would blame himself for her death, would carry guilt about not being there when she needed him most. With remarkable wisdom for someone so young, she'd anticipated his pain and tried to heal it across the decades that would separate her death from his homecoming. The cave had been transformed into something between a memorial and a museum. Working with David Mitchell and the National Park Service, Jonas had created a permanent exhibit that told Sarah's story with the dignity and respect it deserved. Visitors could read excerpts from her journal, see photographs of her belongings, and understand the courage of a young woman who'd faced impossible circumstances with grace and determination. Michael Santos had agreed to return to civilization for the first time in 40 years, accepting Jonas's invitation to help complete Sarah's story. The transition hadn't been easy for a man who'd lived in isolation for so long, but the sense of purpose that came from honoring Sarah's memory had given him strength to navigate the complexities of modern life. Santos had moved into a small cabin near Pine Ridge, close enough to the cave to visit Sarah's grave regularly, but far enough from town to maintain the solitude he still needed. He'd become an unofficial guardian of the memorial, sharing his memories of Sarah's final weeks with visitors who came to learn her story. His presence added authenticity and emotional weight to the exhibit, transforming it from a collection of artifacts into a living testament to love and sacrifice. Martha had taken early retirement from the library to help manage the memorial, finding in the project a way to honor her friendship with Sarah, while ensuring that future generations would understand the true scope of her courage. Together, she and Jonas had written a book about Sarah's life, using her journals and letters to create a portrait of a young woman whose strength had touched everyone who knew her story. The book had found a modest but devoted readership, particularly among families dealing with the aftermath of war and loss. Letters arrived regularly from readers who found comfort in Sarah's example, who drew strength from her refusal to surrender hope even in the darkest circumstances. Jonas kept every letter, filing them in the same careful way Sarah had preserved his correspondence from Vietnam. Rufus had adapted well to his new role as the memorial's unofficial mascot, greeting visitors with the patient dignity of an old dog who understood his place in something larger than himself. The cave's acoustics amplified his gentle barks into welcoming echoes that seemed to embody the spirit of hospitality that Sarah had shown to a wounded stranger during her final weeks. On this particular morning, Jonas was preparing for a special visitor. Santos had called the night before to say that someone wanted to meet them, a young woman who'd contacted him after reading the book about Sarah's life. She claimed to be the granddaughter of Sarah's sister, David Mitchell's cousin, who'd grown up hearing family stories about the aunt who'd vanished in a blizzard, but never knowing the full truth of her fate. When the woman arrived, Jonas immediately saw the family resemblance. She had Sarah's auburn hair and intelligent eyes, the same way of tilting her head when listening carefully. Her name was Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, named after the aunt she'd never met but always wondered about. "I wanted to thank you," she said, standing in the chamber where her great-aunt had spent her final months, for finding her story, for making sure people understand who she really was. "My family always thought she died because she got lost in a storm, that she was a victim of bad luck and bad weather. Learning that she died helping someone else, that she chose courage over safety even when she was afraid. It changes everything." The young woman had brought flowers from Sarah's hometown, wildflowers that grew in the fields where Sarah had walked as a child. She placed them beside the memorial, kneeling quietly for a moment in a gesture that connected past and present across the generations. As they walked together toward the cave entrance, Jonas felt the circle of Sarah's story completing itself. She died believing in a future she'd never see, but that future had arrived in ways she couldn't have imagined. Her love had outlasted her life, had touched strangers who'd never met her, had created connections between people who might otherwise have remained isolated in their own grief and loss. The $20 Jonas had paid for the cave house had been the best investment of his life, though not for the reasons he'd expected when he made the purchase. He'd thought he was buying solitude and escape. Instead, he'd bought the chance to complete a love story that had been interrupted by war and death, but never truly ended. Standing on the ledge with Rufus at his side, watching the morning light paint the lake in shades of gold and silver, Jonas spoke aloud to Sarah as he did every morning. But now his words were filled with gratitude rather than grief, with celebration rather than regret. He'd finally come home to find her waiting, just as she'd always believed he would.